Anapa Air Force Base is within Nellis Test and Training Range in Nevada, and specifically it contains a mountain range called Urania Mountain, which is part of the Urania Mountain Range, in the western Nellis Range on the Tampa Air Force Base. And allegedly how this story goes is that an Air Force intelligence agent investigated this case back in the day along with a partner. And he investigated this case back in the day because there were two women in 1983 who claimed they'd met aliens near the base. These two women were driving on Nevada Route 6, north of Nellis, west of Warm Springs, in September 1983, and they claimed they saw a, quote, spacecraft. It landed, they had a period of missing time, they reported it, and the Nye County Sheriff's Office, for some reason feeling this was quite important, notified Tampa Air Force Base. Immediately, the security police notified the AFOSI, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. At the time, this AFOSI officer was at Groom Lake, and he and another travelled up to the Nellis base to talk to the women. These women were taken to the Nellis hospital and they had strange marks on their bodies. And during hypnosis, they explained they were taken to a huge underground base somewhere in Nevada. And they talked about a mountain, Urania Mountain, in the Cactus Mountain chain, and they very specifically mentioned this base. Now, was this a human base? Was this a base of human experimentation? No, this was an alien base. They talked of, quote, hideous aliens with, quote, elephant noses, very tall, something like 7 feet, but not at all hostile. They kept hearing in their heads telepathically, we're not here to hurt you. Much like with many experiences of people with grey aliens who claim that they've been given similar messages. They claimed there were beings walking around, there were lots of rooms, but there was one operating table in what looked like a huge circular area, and they were placed on there and they couldn't move. Obviously, the AFOSI officer in charge of this case was very curious, so he and several others flew over the area in a helo. They flew over the mountain in a helicopter, they didn't see anything. Then, as the helicopter passed over the top of the mountain opened up and they could see down into it. They claimed the opening was at least half a mile and there were dozens of little rectangular buildings, reflective surfaces, a lit up area, and something in the middle of the centre area. They couldn't tell if it was that table, they couldn't tell if it was a craft, but something was stood there. So, of course, they went to the Tonopah commander's office. Do you have anything you can tell us about Urania Mountain? The AFOSI officer asked. I'm not at liberty to discuss it any further, he said. And he got quite agitated and then said, I'm not at liberty to discuss it any further, you can leave my office. Of course, not being satisfied with this, they sent a teletype up the chain of command. And they talked to the general of Edwards Air Force Base, and his response was baffled. He says, I don't know what you're talking about. It's the first I've ever heard of this. The general called the colonel, and the colonel said, General, I can't tell you. The general was a bit miffed at this, and he said, is it because I'm not briefed? And he goes, General, I just can't tell you. And the general immediately got these two AFOSI officers security clearance, partly because he was so enraged and wanted to put the colonel up for court-martial. The two agents then went back to Tampa the next day after getting a call, and the colonel briefed them, red-faced and looking enraged. He simply said, as if angered that this was something out of his control that he couldn't manage, there's something going on down there that we don't know about. There's aliens down there. And the officers were startled. They said, aliens down there? And he said, yep, there's aliens down there. And the officers contacted Washington, D.C., and it turned out D.C. didn't know anything about it either. So right on one of America's most secure bases, underneath a mountain, there was an alien base. And the AFOSI agent, carrying a 45 and 15 or 16 troops with M16s plus his partner, went down there. There was a doorway underneath the mountain that led to an old mine, and they went down there to explore because the commander of the base had said that previously some of his men had been down there, they'd encountered an alien with an elephant-like face, and they just got out of there. They hadn't done any investigating, they just thought better leave it alone, they got out of there. As they went down there, initially there was very little to see. It was an entirely dark tunnel once they got beyond the sealed door, and their flashlights were on, and they must have walked a good 2 miles or so. But then something was illuminated, and there was a humming sound, and an alien appeared. 50 yards away, a tall alien appeared. The being was tall and thin, and reptilian-looking, and had what looked like an elephant-like nose, although the agent later specified it could have been some kind of mask. He couldn't see any eyes, but he knew it was looking at them. It wasn't aggressive, it didn't attack, they just looked at each other. However, he did notice that when he stepped forward, the being stepped forward. And when he stepped back, the being stepped back. His partner said to him, we need to get out of here. So, feeling like discretion was the best part of valor, they retreated back down the cabin and they went out of the mountain shaft and they went back up top and reported it to High Command. Like I said, Washington, D.C. knew absolutely nothing about this, but very interestingly, a few months later, there was a large explosion done on the mountain, allegedly as a, quote, test, but the AFOSI agent and his partner explicitly understood this was a destruction of the alien base. It wasn't sure why the base was authorised to be destroyed. Was it eavesdropping on base communications? Did the government not like the fact that it was abducting people? Was it seen as inherently subversive when it was right next to a base? We don't know. But either way, he claimed there was alien pushback. A nearby facility which cost millions of dollars was inexplicably destroyed one day. Another time, another facility was blown up. We don't know if the aliens ever recovered their relations with the humans, if they had any at all, but either way, it's understandable why they were miffed. Even though they were on Earth and maybe abducting people for tests, they weren't killing anyone, they weren't harming anyone, they weren't causing any kind of trouble, and they were blown up. For all we know, this could have been a research base key to the survival of their species. And they were blown up. But this story could also be blown up because it's told by Rick Doty. Yep, Rick Doty, that very same Rick Doty who was an officer at Ellsworth Air Force Base at a time when a fake alleged shootout between aliens was alleged to have happened, and he told a very similar story several years later about the time 2 aliens allegedly landed at a base and offered the technicians a Google Translate device. And he told another story sometime later about 2 aliens landing at a base who were then attacked by the humans. And he's told similar stories later of aliens that were at a base, one escaped and killed a human. Every few years he comes up with very similar stories. 2 beings are encountered by humans. These beings are either hostile, or they're in some way menacing, or they're in some way maybe naive, but not intentionally menacing. But either way, there's always a story. There's always, there were 2 beings in a shootout, 2 beings stealing equipment, 2 beings abducting people. And you might think, okay, maybe these are real stories. He was an Air Force officer. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations is supposed to conduct disinformation operations. Oh, I'm sorry, deception operations in quotes. They are supposed to disinform people. If there's any perceived threat to the base or any perceived threat to a program, they are supposed to investigate this threat and put a stop to it. That is literally what they do. That is literally their job. For example, he's talked before about using people with deformities and disabilities to break into people's houses and convince them that they're seeing aliens after they've stumbled on classified military programs, so they don't assume it's a military program. He's talked about planting bugs in people's houses, and the worst thing he did was to Paul Benowitz. Paul Benowitz was a researcher living out of Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, just outside the base. He began photographing strange lights in the sky, intercepting strange signals. He believed they were aliens, and the base, with Rick Doty at the head of this, assured him of this. They took him to a nearby mountain and directed his attention there. They positioned fake vents and things on the mountain to make it look like it was hollow. They positioned cars around it, a fake shot-up craft. Think about this. They made a fake alien base, much like the alleged alien base in Urania Mountain, to convince him to look away from the Air Force Base, because Doty said later they were running a top secret program out of there. They convinced him it was aliens, and Paul went mad. He lost his mind, he ended up in a mental health asylum, and a few years later Rick Doty came out and said, oh yeah, we supplied Paul Benowitz with disinformation, but it was all okay because we were protecting the base. And truly, it's an example of how the world isn't fair sometimes. Paul Benowitz is lying cold and dead in his grave after his life was cut short, and there's only like 1 photo of him online, and it's a bad one. And Rick Doty has 1 million YouTube videos, has deals, goes on podcasts, is making loads of money. So we can't fundamentally trust anything Rick Doty says. We are intrigued by the fact that every good deception operation has some truth behind it, but we cannot speculate on what the truth is because Rick Doty is so unreliable. But what do you guys think? Do you think this was a fascinating story? Do you feel like you've been sold a bill of goods? Did you work at Urania Mountain at the time? Do you know anyone who did? I would love to corroborate this story, and it's very, very tempting to obsess over these stories, to look into the documents, or lack thereof, to try and find out if they're true, but the problem with Rick Doty is that people like this lie like larks warble, like blackbirds trill, like Trump eats Cheetos. They are fundamentally, inherently unreliable and cannot be trusted, so it's pointless to go down this route of inquiry, tempting as it is. It's an interesting yarn, but that's at the end of the day all it is. But what do you guys think? Please let me know in the comments below, and please check out my other selection of UFO deep dives and debunkings. I debunk with the genuine belief that UFOs are real, but with some healthy skepticism.